Thank you. I'm going to read from a thing because even though Darienne is my coworker part-time, Darienne is also a PhD student at the University of Victoria. She has been working on research that focuses on new and non-destructive tools for monitoring rockfish, primarily acoustic tools. She loves all things rockfish related and has completed her master's in 2015 through the recreational fisher compliance in Rockfish Conservation Areas, so research in that area. Darienne has also worked as a scientific diver for coral reef conservation in the Philippines, as a BC park ranger on the Sunshine Coast, and a biologist with Fisheries Post in Canada and Newfoundland and now BC, and largely has focused on rockfish conservation areas, juvenile Atlantic cod and Atlantic salmon. Darienne now lives in Victoria and is commonly spotted out at dive sites or hiking or camping near the ocean. So without any further ado, I'll let you take over, Darienne. If people have questions, you can use the chat or we can wait till the end. Darienne, do you have any preference?
It doesn't matter to me. I can't really see the meeting right now. So if you do want to just interrupt and say that there's a question, then I can stop. Or you can just hold them to the end. Either works. Okay. Are you able to hear me okay right now?
I can hear you great. And if anyone has very pressing questions, put them in the chat and then I'll pause, Darienne. And then there's also this react button down at the bottom of your screen where you can click on it and it does things like you can raise hand, you can give thumbs ups, love things, whatever you want. There's a fun button down there. All right, thanks, Darienne. I'll let you take over.
Excellent. All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining tonight. It's very exciting to get to share some of this research. I've been working on it for the last 4 years. And it's really exciting as a researcher when you get to the point that you are able to share some exciting results. So I'm really happy to be able to give you a little walkthrough of it tonight. So as Heidi mentioned, my name is Darienne and I'm a PhD candidate in the biology department at UVic. I'm supervised by Dr. Dana Haggerty, who works out of the DFO Nanaimo office and is often called the Rockfish Lady, so I'm in good hands. And then I'm also co-supervised by Dr. Francis Juanez, who works in biology at UVic. And I'm gonna be talking you through my research on the amazing sounds of rockfish in BC. And specifically, I've been trying to figure out if we can identify different species calls and the implications that may have for using acoustics to monitor fish in the future. Let's see if I can advance here. There you go. Did that advance for you? Can you tell me, Heidi?
Yes, we did.
Okay, perfect. Excellent. I just wanted to give you a bit of a background. Heidi already went through it a bit, but I did do a master's degree about 10 years ago now, back at UVic with Dr. Natalie Ban. And during that project, I studied recreational fisher compliance in rockfish conservation areas around the Southern Gulf Islands. And it's really exciting because that monitoring work is still going on. It's still run by Natalie Ban and the Galiano Conservancy Association. We use trail cameras overlooking these conservation areas to document illegal fishing events. And the Galiano Conservancy has done a ton of work to put out educational materials around docks and marinas. So hopefully you guys have seen some of those materials around. I also worked on a follow-up project after that with Lily Burke, who was doing her master's, and we were diving inside and outside rockfish conservation areas to see whether they were working to rebuild the rockfish populations in those protected areas. So I've been working a lot on rockfish in the past, but I also started moving around a bit, and I ended up in the Philippines for a year working as the project scientist for coral cay conservation. I worked on building marine protected areas, and I also got to train students as scientific divers. This is a photo of me on my 300th dive on a coral reef. It was really exciting for me, that dive. And I also was really lucky and I worked as a park ranger on the Sunshine Coast, and I got to monitor all the marine kayaking boat access only sites. So that was a very exciting job. I also worked over in Newfoundland and Labrador for 4 years. It was an incredible experience working over there. I got to monitor juvenile Atlantic cod and eelgrass beds, and I got to do a project on lumpfish, which are these crazy looking green blobs that you can see in the center there. They're pretty hilarious little fish, and they can get to be about the size of a basketball. I also got to go to the Torngat Mountains to tag Arctic char And I did some electrofishing in the southern fjords of Newfoundland, where we got to fly around in the helicopter. But after a few years in Newfoundland, I really decided that I missed rockfish still. And so I wanted to head back to BC and start my PhD. So as I mentioned before, this project is on identifying wild species-specific rockfish sounds, and I'm collaborating with Fisheries and Oceans Canada, University of Victoria, and Haum Fisheries Society, which represents 5 of the First Nations along the west coast of Vancouver Island. But before I get too far into my research, I want to just give you a background on the world of underwater sounds. Originally, before I started this project, I, like many people, thought of the oceans as a very calm, tranquil, quiet place. But in reality, the oceans are actually teeming with sounds. There are sounds from all kinds of marine animals like whales and dolphins, which we would typically think of, but also fish and snapping shrimp, and even clams can make noises. There's also sounds made by the environment, which is called geophony. This is things like earthquakes and waves. And then there are many man-made sounds going on, which you can see some in this picture. So why do marine animals make sounds? Oftentimes they're making sounds to communicate with each other. They're calling to attract mates, or they're making alarm calls to scare off predators or warn others of the threat, or they're calling to find their families. Animals can also make lots of noises when they're feeding. These can be really specific sounds like echolocation to locate prey, or more general sounds like actual crunching and popping while they're chewing. And all of these sounds provide marine animals with really important information about their surroundings so they can navigate and survive. But a lot of man-made sounds threaten marine animals' ability to hear underwater. Sounds like boat noise in particular can be so loud that animals can't communicate with each other, which makes it harder to find a mate, harder to find prey, and hard to avoid predators. Other really loud noises like seismic surveys and pile driving can actually cause temporary or permanent deafness in marine animals. So for us as researchers, it's really important to start to understand the sounds going on underwater so we can protect these animals and learn more about what they need to communicate and survive. So for my part, I've decided to focus that research on fish sounds. So why should we study fish sounds at all? Firstly, just on a fun note, I think it's really interesting to understand marine animals. Just like it's kind of fun to recognize the sound of a chickadee when you're out for a walk or a frog call, it's exciting to be able to hear underwater sounds and know what fish is making that noise. But more importantly than just the fun bit is that fish sounds can actually be used to count and identify where specific species are living. And many animal sounds like bird song and frog chorusing are already used on land to count those animals and know what habitats they prefer. But we haven't applied the same technique to fish in the ocean yet. And that's really too bad because there's some major benefits to using sounds to monitor fish. Firstly, recording sounds is completely non-destructive and non-invasive to fish, unlike lethal hook and line surveys, which are often used to monitor rockfish. Hydrophones, which are underwater microphones, can record fish sounds for very long periods. They can be left out for months or years because their batteries last so long. And they can record fish information in low visibility conditions like nighttime or deep water and muddy water. And this is something that video monitoring often struggles with. Hydrophones are also quite affordable, costing only a few $100s for the cheaper models. And we're beginning to automate this sound analysis, so it's actually going to be faster than a lot of other methods like video analysis. So it sounds like acoustic monitoring is a fantastic option, but we still have a lot to learn about fish sounds before we can really apply acoustic monitoring in this way. So first, I'm going to introduce you to the stars of this particular show, which are rockfish. These fish are amazing. I spend a lot of time underwater as a diver. And they're some of the most colorful and common creatures I get to see. There are 41 different species in BC, including this black and white China rockfish, and the one in the pink photo is a quillback rockfish. Rockfish are also extremely long-lived. Some species live over 200 years. And many species have high site fidelity, which means they're big homebodies. And they'll often spend their entire long lives on a single boulder pile. So they act as a great indicator of reef health and potential overfishing issues. But because of this homebody characteristic, rockfish and other rocky reef fish species like lingcod and kelp greenling are very vulnerable to overfishing, especially in nearshore coastal environments. And multiple species are currently listed as threatened or species of special concern by conservation groups like COSUIC and SARA. So acoustic monitoring, which is non-destructive, offers a really exciting opportunity to develop a new, more effective, non-lethal reef fish monitoring method. So how are these fish actually making sounds? Saying that they vocalize is a bit of a stretch because they don't have vocal cords. But what rockfish have instead is a large air-filled bladder inside them called a swim bladder. They usually use this as a buoyancy device to stay where they want in the water. But they also have these muscles running along the side called sonic muscles. It's a lot like wrapping a rubber band around a balloon. If you were to snap the rubber band, it will make these kind of drumming noises, which is exactly what the rockfish do with their sonic muscles. So now we know why we should study rockfish and how they're making the sounds. So now we can get into my research. I have a couple of guiding research questions since very little was known about rockfish and their sounds when I first started my project. The biggest question I wanted to answer is, do rocky reef fish make unique species and size dependent calls? Basically, can we tell what kind of fish is calling based on the sound alone? It's a lot like birders identifying birds based on their unique songs. Secondly, I want to look at vocalizing behavior. Are rockfish making noises when they're feeding? Is it a sign of aggression between fish, or is it social calling? Basically trying to figure out where your fish friends are. Thirdly, I need to find out how often rockfish are calling. Is it once a minute, once an hour, or once a day? And is this calling rate fairly consistent across time and species? And all of these questions will build to a larger overarching question, which is there a relationship between number of calls and number of fish? For example, do we consistently see higher numbers of fish calls at sites with more rockfish? And can we use this relationship, if it does exist, to develop a way to count how many rockfish are underwater using only the sounds they make? So to answer all of these questions, I spent 2 amazing months up in Bamfield in 2022, collecting some really cool passive acoustic data. I was lucky enough to use this passive acoustic localization array that was designed by a previous UVic PhD student, Xavier Moy, who's also in this picture. Here's a few images of us loading the array onto the boat. You can see it takes quite a few people to get it on there. And then we very awkwardly have to lower it off the side into the water. And then that's an image of me rolling backwards off the boat to go dive down and place it in rocky reef fish habitat. Now I have a video of the array underwater. I think the video might be a bit laggy, but I'll try and walk you through it anyway. Hopefully it works for you. So this is the array where we placed it in rocky reef fish habitat. That's my friend Evan, who was helping me dive and place the array. You can see it's actually massive. It's 2 meters by 2 meters by 3 meters high. And there's a large battery pack in the center. And then around the corners, there are 6 different underwater microphones or hydrophones that we use to localize the fish sounds. And here I'm just swimming up over top of the array. And that's an underwater video camera that's pointing down to give a bird's eye view of any of the fish that swim through this kind of fish house. It's got a massive battery pack, so we could leave it down for a couple of weeks. And it gives you this awesome downward view. And soon you'll see right over top, there's a microphone right in the center and a large battery pack. And then I'm going to pan over to the side here. And there's also 2 forward-facing cameras. And these 2 cameras are called stereo cameras, and they allow you to get fish length from the video. So in case that video didn't work well for you, here's a photo of it as well. You can see the hydrophones are all circled in yellow. So there's 6 of them, and they're perfectly positioned to triangulate where sounds are coming from. The white box is showing the downward-facing video camera, and the blue box is showing the forward-facing stereo cameras. And then this is a copper rockfish with a visualization of it making a call and getting it triangulated within the array. So I deployed the array at quite a few sites, but today I'm going to just focus on results from 2 sites, Taylor Islet and Danger Rocks. The array was deployed for 10 days at each site, and it recorded all day and all night. Now, just as a quick side note, after seeing how difficult that looked, you might be wondering, why didn't you just collect a few rockfish and study them in a tank? And that probably would have been a lot easier, but there are lots of problems with tank studies. Firstly, the way sound moves or propagates underwater, especially in loud, smooth-walled aquariums, can completely alter the characteristics of a fish sound. So what you identify as a rockfish sound in a tank may be totally unrecognizable if you were to record it out in the ocean in deep, rough, rocky areas. Secondly, fish aren't going to behave naturally in a tank environment, and I really want to figure out their natural calling patterns. And finally, this whole project is testing the feasibility of passive acoustic monitoring for rockfish in the real world. So we need to test it in the real world, where we'll encounter all the actual issues that face this kind of monitoring, things like boat noise. So how do you go about processing all this data? Firstly, I ran the raw acoustic data through a localization algorithm that Xavier Moy developed during his PhD. And this uses something called time difference of arrival to generate coordinates for each sound. So basically, a sound will be made and it's going to slowly travel through the water and hit each hydrophone at a slightly different time. And using that difference in time, you can generate a coordinate of where the sound came from. So for an example, at our first Taylor Islet site, every one of these black dots is a sound that was localized inside the array. So there was 8,000 localized sounds. And now we can overlay the array on top of it. And you can see there's kind of a clustering of black points at that far back corner. And that's because there was a big boulder rock wall zone where there was a lot of fish sounds. But not every single one of these sounds came from a fish. So then I needed to manually figure out which of these black dots was actually made by a fish and not just bubbles or invertebrate snapping sounds, things like that. So to do this, I had to head over to Raven Pro software and I looked at something called a spectrogram. This is like a sound picture. Now, I'm going to walk you through one of these because the first time I saw one, I had absolutely no clue what was going on. So hopefully I can explain it to you. Along the bottom, you have time. So it shows multiple calls in a sequence. Then on the left, you can see frequency, which is basically how low or high pitched a sound is. And then you can see loudness of the sound on the right-hand side. So those warmer colors are going to be louder and the cooler colors are quiet. So at the start of the spectrogram, you see a picture of a fish grunt. Now you can recognize grunts because they usually have these layers of sounds at different frequencies. These layers are called harmonics, and they're really common for fish grunts, but they're also really common in human voices. So if you saw a spectrogram of me talking right now, you'd be seeing lots of these layers of sounds. Then you'll see a fish knock, which is a quicker solid sound made by the fish quickly drumming or knocking on their swim bladder. And finally, I've highlighted some background boat noise. So this boat noise is really common, and sometimes it gets so loud it completely drowns out the fish sounds. But in this particular clip, we can still see the fish sounds, luckily. So let's play this sound and get an idea of what fish grunts and knocks sound like. I do recommend you turn up your volume as much as you can because a lot of these sounds are quite quiet. Hopefully it plays for you. So there it is. There's your first fish sound. Hopefully you were able to hear it. And so then what we do is once you've identified each sound that was made by the fish, we can go back to our underwater videos. So the first thing I do is I create a plot of the fish sound coordinate to figure out where exactly in the frame the sound happened. So in this plot, you can see exactly where a fish sound occurred. So imagine we're the downward facing camera looking down at the seafloor. Then I can overlay that underwater video and get a bird's eye view. It's a little hard to see the fish in here, but I've circled it for you. It's a copper rockfish, and it's exactly where that sound coordinate was. And these coordinates are essential for differentiating species because down at the bottom here, there's also a kelp greenling in the frame. So if I didn't have that coordinate, I'd never know which of those fish was making the sound. So after all this analysis, it's really exciting to get into some results. So overall, I identified 1,107 fish sounds from 8 different fish species. Sometimes I couldn't identify the sounds to a species with a lot of confidence, usually because it was getting dark or the water visibility was bad. So the ones I was really about 100% confident of was 613 sounds. And those sounds belong to quillback rockfish, which made 53 sounds. Copper rockfish, which made 197 sounds. Canary rockfish made 255 sounds. Black rockfish made 73 sounds. Vermilion rockfish were not very chatty and they only made 2 sounds. Lingcod made 52 sounds. Pile perch made 15 sounds. And kelp greenling made 52 sounds. It's really exciting to lay out the diversity of fish that we were able to identify in this project. It's so cool knowing that all of these different fish are down there making noises all the time. So let's look at these species sounds in a little bit more detail. Here's a spectrogram of a copper rockfish knock. Again, there's 3 knocks pictured here, and you can see if you're looking at the frequency on the left-hand side, they're going from about 0 hertz all the way up to about 550 hertz. And then here is a copper rockfish grunt. Again, you can see those bands, which are harmonics. And then we can loop back to that same spectrogram we were looking at before, but now we know it was made by a copper rockfish. And I'm just going to play it again. Nice long grunt at the end. So now that we're knowing a little bit more about what spectrograms look like, here are all the knock spectrograms for the 8 species I identified. Now, you're probably thinking a lot of them look quite similar, but some of them are kind of distinctive. So I'll play some quillback knocks for you. Now listen carefully because they're quite quiet and fast. Cute little noises. And then I'm going to play a canary rockfish knock. If you look at the spectrogram, you can kind of see that they're slightly higher frequency, and you can maybe listen for that in the sound as well. A little bit higher pitched. Then the black rockfish knocks are a shorter bandwidth, which means they don't cover as many frequencies. You'll see they're kind of stubbier little knock bars. Rapid succession of knocks. And then I'm not even going to bother playing the vermilion knock sound because it's so quiet and low frequency, you'd have a really hard time hearing it. But as you can see, it's definitely more distinctive than a lot of them because it's got a much shorter bandwidth and it's very low frequency. Now looking at the grunts, for the copper and quillback rockfish, you can see those harmonic bands going up through the different frequencies. The canary rockfish grunt is quite different looking and doesn't show those bright harmonics. And then the black rockfish knock looks quite different with that short bandwidth and many repeated, almost mini knocks smushed together. So let's listen to the quillback rockfish grunt. I think it sounds a bit like a frog. And then we'll listen to the black rockfish grunt. It's very faint, so it may be hard to hear, but what you're listening for is a kind of purring growl sound. If you couldn't hear that very well, I do like to imitate the black rockfish sound. It goes, my best impression. Now this is the most distinctive sound that I've recorded, and I can always recognize it even when I just see them or hear them. It's definitely the most distinctive. So looping back to my first research question, do we know if rocky reef fish make unique species and size dependent calls? So from this research, we now know that lots of rocky reef fish are making noises, but that doesn't answer the question of if we can tell them apart. And as you're probably thinking right now, a lot of those sounds look very similar and sound very similar to the human eye and ear. So what I did was I used very precise sound features and computer models to identify the differences in sounds that are hard to perceive by eye and ear alone. So I looked at 47 different sound features. I've highlighted a few of the most important ones for you on this copper rockfish knock. You can see measurements like frequency 75% up near the top of that knock, and that will identify some of the higher frequency trends. And then frequency 25% identifies some of the lower frequency trends. And I looked at things like frequency centroid, which shows the central tendency of the knock. So basically what this does is it outlines the shape of each species sound. How long is it? What are the high and low ranges of frequencies? Where is the loudest part of the sound located? And what I found from these measurements is very encouraging. I put all these sound measurements into something called a random forest model. Now, I'm going to try and explain a random forest model to you. It's really just a complicated version of a basic decision tree. So a decision tree uses yes and no branches to determine the features of what you're trying to look at. So in this example, we're trying to tell apart cats from dogs. So the first question, for determining cats versus dogs is, are the ears of this animal pointy? If they're not, then it's certainly going to be a dog because all cats have pointy ears. But some dogs also have pointy ears, so we need to ask a follow-up question. In this case, does it bark? If it barks, then it's a dog. If it doesn't bark, it's a cat. So those are the features that start to help tell those animals apart. So what I did for sound is something similar. This is very simplified, but imagine I asked if the main frequency of a fish sound is less than 400 hertz. The only fish that has a frequency higher than that is a canary rockfish. So that's now a feature of canary rockfish. But then what if I asked, is dominant frequency less than 200 hertz? The only fish with a sound that low is the vermilion rockfish. And then copper rockfish is somewhere between 400 and 200. So that helps identify it. Now, what a random forest model does is it asks these questions in many different orders with many different sound features hundreds of times until hopefully it develops a strong ability to classify sounds from different species of fish. But if the sounds are all really similar to each other, it still won't be able to tell them apart, even if it asks all these questions. But what I found is really encouraging. Here's a plot of all the different species fish knocks. Now, the different colors are for different species. So basically, the yellow ones are canary rockfish, the green dots are copper rockfish. And basically what it's showing is that groupings of sounds that are very similar will be close together on the plot, and sounds that are quite different will be farther apart. So for example, copper rockfish and canary rockfish don't overlap at all in the plot, which means they're very different and easy to tell those knocks apart from each other. But some species like copper and quillback knocks are more similar and group more closely together, so they're harder to tell apart. But overall, the random forest model did a really good job of telling fish sounds apart from each other. I applied the same random forest model to look at grunt sounds, and these ones separated from each other even better. The copper and quillback rockfish grunts are similar, but not overlapping too much. It also makes a lot of sense that they're similar because these two species are closely related and actually sometimes hybridize and interbreed. But you can see the black rockfish grunts are very different from copper and quillback. So that means they're very easy to tell apart. So what does this all mean? Basically, what my research has shown is that rocky reef fish knocks and grunts are unique enough to be recognized by computer models and sometimes even by eye and ear. And this means we can develop a species-specific fish sound detector where we can put underwater audio recordings through an algorithm and it will tell us what fish are underwater. This is really important for conservation of vulnerable species and for designing marine protected areas that target specific species groupings. But what about fish size? That was another important part of my research question. So here's a scatter plot of fish knocks. You've got frequency on the left and you've got fish length along the bottom. And so you'll notice that the lines are all descending downward as fish get longer. And this means that little fish are making higher pitch knocks and big fish are making lower pitch knocks. Now, this is really similar to humans. Just like children will have higher pitched voices and adults will have lower pitched voices as our lungs and bodies get bigger. I also found the same trend in fish grunts, with littler fish making higher pitched grunts and big fish making lower grunts. So why is that important? This is really important because now we know that fish knocks and grunts get lower as fish get bigger. That means we can estimate fish size just from listening to their sounds. And fish size is really essential for fisheries managers to know for stock assessment. This is a measurement called biomass, and it's a major tool for setting catch limits in fisheries and determining how old fish are so we know how to protect them better. So now we know a lot about species-specific sounds and how fish size impacts sounds. But what about fish behavior? So when and why do fish vocalize? Now, I documented behavior every time I looked at a fish sound, and I found some pretty interesting results, actually. Here's a bar plot I'm going to walk you through. We've got each bar representing a different fish species. And the colors along the right-hand side represent the different behaviors that I documented. Now you'll notice there's a lot of green, and this green represents no activity was visible. So this basically means that a lot of rocky reef fish were making sounds, but not doing much while they were calling. Now this is probably because we can't always visually understand what's going on underwater. Just like a bird might sit on a branch and make a lot of different meaningful calls that we can't always understand. But I did visually see some interesting behavior paired up with fish sounds. The yellow color represents feeding activities. So these were sounds that happened while a fish was actively eating something or chasing down small prey. So here's an example video for you. I hope the video is not too laggy. This is that bird's eye view again. And there's going to be a quillback rockfish coming in from the right-hand corner and chasing some small prey along the bottom. Now there's a series of knocks and grunts as it chases some small creature across the seafloor there. Now another really interesting behavior is fleeing behavior. Now you can see that copper rockfish were often making noises while fleeing, and that's that orange color. And quillback rockfish, black rockfish, and pile perch were also occasionally seen fleeing. Now something really interesting I found about the fleeing events was that copper and quillback rockfish made significantly more grunting sounds when they were running away from another fish. So this likely means that many repetitions of fish grunts are a kind of distress call for these two species. So here's a spectrogram for the sounds a copper rockfish made while fleeing. You can see there's 4 big grunt sounds with those big harmonic bands. Now usually copper rockfish more commonly knock, so that's a lot of grunts to see in a copper rockfish calling sequence. So let's listen to this fleeing sound. Couple of knocks, but mostly grunts. And then here's a quillback rockfish fleeing sound. Again, there are 5 grunts, which is a lot for a quillback. And we can listen to this sequence as well. So that's the sound it made as it was being chased by another fish. So here's an example video of a copper rockfish being chased by a kelp greenling. See him coming in from the right there. Short little chase sequence, but he was definitely unhappy about it, I would say. I also found that when fish were being chased, it was always a larger fish chasing a smaller fish. So it seems like size really matters for rockfish, and there were a lot of territorial displays going on underwater. And then finally, here's an interesting video of an octopus being surrounded by multiple different fish species and lots of knock sounds, which may indicate territorial or curious vocalization behavior. The octopus is near the top right corner, and it's about to touch a lingcod with its tentacle. See the octopus chasing the lingcod there. And there you go. Hopefully it wasn't too laggy, but trust me, it's a very cool video. So what does this mean? Rocky reef fish make many behavior-related noises. And repeated grunting is associated with fleeing behavior in copper and quillback rockfish. So now we can estimate territorial activity underwater by counting the number of grunts in a fish call sequence. And territorial behavior may happen more often in locations where there are more fish, or it may happen in areas where there's a higher diversity of fish. Now back to my other research question, how often are rockfish making sounds? Now, this is something important to know so we can start to estimate how many fish are there based on the number of calls they make. So maybe some fish are more chatty than others. So I took a look at the number of calls per minute on average. And the chattiest fish I found were copper rockfish, with about 5 calls per minute on average. And copper rockfish often call repeatedly in a sequence, and they're often making sounds. Now, quillback rockfish are the second chattiest, with 4 calls per minute. Again, that's not super surprising because these two species are closely related. Now, many of the fish I recorded are much less talkative. Canary, black, kelp greenling, and lingcod only called about once per minute, and pile perch and vermilion rockfish seem to be very shy with less than 1 call per minute. And this means that most of the time they were on camera, they were quiet and not making any noise. So this gives us a really rough estimate of how to convert calls into an estimate of how many fish are there. For example, if I recorded 10 copper rockfish calls in 1 minute, I could assume that there were 2 copper rockfish. But if I recorded only 2 lingcod calls per minute, even though that's a lot fewer sounds, I'd also assume there are 2 lingcod because they have a much lower call rate. Now, this is of course very simplified, but it's the first steps towards estimating fish abundance with fish sounds. So what's next for this research? In the rest of my PhD, and hopefully as a researcher after I finish my degree, I'd like to keep digging into this question of, is there a relationship between how many calls we hear and how many fish are at a location? I'm going to use this information on fish calling rates to develop an abundance estimation model to count fish. I'm also going to research how far away from a hydrophone we can hear fish, and if there are certain times of day and certain times of year that fish call more. I also really want to see if I can detect fish sounds when boats are making a lot of noise, to see if we can monitor in busy locations like marinas. I also plan to build a species-specific fish sound detector. There's already a fish sound detector that Xavier Moy created, and that can tell you if you recorded any fish sounds, but it can't tell you what species made the sounds. So knowing what species are present at a location is really important for protecting species and deciding where to create those marine protected areas. And building this fish sound detector will make all this research a lot more useful to other people too. This means they can make their own recordings and use this tool to understand what fish live in their area. I also want to compare the sounds I recorded in Bamfield to sounds for the same species in different regions. In bird research, it's been found that the same species of birds can make distinctly different sounds in different locations. This is kind of like regional accents in humans and even different languages. So I need to find out if fish have accents and different dialects depending on where they live. And I assume all of this research will keep me busy for quite a few more years. There's also some great tools that will have some major impacts on how we monitor and conserve rocky reef fish in the future. Firstly, this will be a totally non-invasive and non-destructive way to study our fish species, and it's great to be able to get the information you need as a scientist without hurting or disturbing the creatures you're trying to protect. These tools can also be adapted and used by scientists all over the world, where they can record their local fish sounds and develop monitoring tools for them. And this will also help managers and conservationists study more areas, because this method is really great for low visibility. It's perfect for leaving out over winter or in remote locations you can't get to very often. It's affordable, and it will be quick to analyze once we develop that fish sound detector. So overall, I'm really excited for what's to come for the rest of this research. And that just about wraps up the wonderful world of fish sounds. I do want to thank all of my incredible collaborators and analysts. I've worked with a lot of really incredibly talented and smart people on this. So I want to thank Dana Haggerty and Francis Wan as my co-supervisors, Xavier Moy and Stéphane Gauthier, my committee members, Stephanie Archer, Felina English, William Halliday, Sarah Dudas, and Aislinn Adams, who've helped out so much on the project. And I also want to thank my massive field crew, Shane Gross, who took some amazing underwater photos for me, the Bamfield Marine Science Center, the Juanes Lab, and everyone else who has helped on this project. Thank you so much, everyone, and I can take questions.
That was fantastic. Well done.
Thank you.
I love it because I work with you and I just learned so much. I should talk to you more. I honestly didn't know how far along we were. Like I didn't realize, how much
That's
you can
very
differentiate
exciting.
each species and what they're doing. It's so great. Everyone, there's a little react button at the bottom if anyone wants to clap with me, or you're welcome to turn on your screens and raise your hands. Dana, do you want to ask your question yourself? You're welcome to turn on your screen, or if not, I'll read it loud for you. All right, I'm going to do it for you. So did you discover any sounds from animals that you weren't expecting?
You know, I didn't discover any from animals I wasn't expecting because I specifically went through and only looked at the fish sounds. So I kind of went through those spectrograms and I only flagged the fish sounds, but there were a lot of other weird looking noises that did get localized within the array. So if we ever wanted to look for that, there is a whole data set of localized sounds, and we could look for kind of different animal sounds. I did see some really cool humpback whale sounds that were carrying on kind of in this repetitive sequence while I was looking for fish sounds. And I heard a lot of harbor seals and sea lions, which make this really kind of like intimidating, heavy breathing sound. So you can always tell when there's one in the array.
Love it. That's very cool. If people listened really close, would any of these sounds be audible to people, especially if they were like out of water?
So, you know, I'm not totally sure about that. When I work on this, I amplify the sounds to make it a little bit more audible. But I think some of them, especially if you were right close, when they're really close to the hydrophone, it's quite loud. So I think if they were out of the water, you could probably hear them. But again, I want to do more research on how far fish sounds travel, but it's not a super long distance. It's usually only about 10 to 30 meters, 30 meters in like perfect quiet conditions, 10 meters on average. So they're pretty quiet sounds, but I dive a lot, and I feel like if I took my hood off and I was close to a rockfish, I'd be able to hear them. Sometimes I like stop breathing underwater to see if they'll make a noise, but I haven't heard one yet. But I have dove in the tropics without a hood, and you can hear all kinds of weird fish sounds going on. So I'm pretty confident that you would be able to hear one.
Oh my gosh, I love that. Now I'm going to be listening for little rockfish grunts. Like they're so grunty. I love it.
They're so
like
grunty.
When that one was running away from the octopus, it just sounded like, oh God, oh,
yeah,
you know,
right.
I gotta get going. Yeah. All right. Next question is, do you have any criteria for what species of fish you include or exclude from your study? And then there's follow-up, like what was this limited to just rockfish? You mentioned lingcod a couple times. Are they related to rockfish?
Yeah, so I've kind of been using this general term rocky reef fish because we did end up identifying other species other than rockfish. So basically the way we're setting our criteria is we set the array in rocky reef habitat. So these are all rocky reef fish. Rockfish are all related to each other. Lingcod and kelp greenling and pile perch are not related to rockfish. But basically we just identified any sound that was a fish sound. And we didn't care what type of species it belonged to. So that was all the species of fish that we had recordings for. But yeah, so lingcod are not related, but they occupy really similar habitat, and kelp greenling also. If you go dive in a rocky reef, you're always going to see lingcod, kelp greenling, and rockfish all together. So it's kind of nice to study them as well. One thing I didn't mention is that a lot of the chasing interactions was kelp greenlings chasing rockfish. So it seems like there's almost this species interaction between those two species. And there's been some lingcod chasing black rockfish. So it's definitely important to study not just the rockfish, all the kind of rocky reef fish that live there.
Awesome, thank you. Does anybody else want to raise their hands and turn on their thing? Or I'll read another from the chat. Why would a greenling chase a rockfish if it's not for prey?
Yeah, so that, like I said, it was the most common chaser fish. I think probably they're quite territorial. There's not I mean, it's hard to say, but these rocky reefs are kind of a hot commodity. They're a really, really great place to live. And it seems like all of these fish almost have like a home range. So I would assume that it's a competition thing. And it was always larger fish chasing smaller fish. So the kelp greenlings are often larger than those small rockfish, which the depths I was studying, rockfish tend to be juvenile, subadult. They're not quite as big as they normally get. So maybe kelp greenlings are a bit of the top dogs in that area, besides lingcod, which get really massive.
Cool. Next question. Could you hear a difference in sounds between female and male greenlings?
I didn't look at that yet. Interesting thing that happened with the kelp greenlings is I identified sounds for them, but none of those sounds were confidently identified. So I haven't actually been able to really confidently say that I know what the greenlings sound like. I think I recorded something like 52 calls, but they were always either the fish was moving so fast that I couldn't be certain of the coordinate, or it was nighttime and I couldn't be certain what species it was. So those were my best guesses of the greenling sounds, but I'm still a little bit hesitant to say that I know for sure what a greenling sounds like. So I would love to do a little bit more research to get kelp greenling sounds for sure, because they're one that we're still a little shaky on. We think they're making noises, but we weren't 100% confident like we were with the other species.
Okay, cool. Did you observe any impacts or reaction to human caused sounds? Like, were you able to hear when boats would come by? And yeah.
So that's such a great question. I actually would love to do a project on that. We have all the data for that. A lot. We were monitoring for 20 days, right? Day and night, but we were only able to document like just over 600 sounds confidently. And a lot of that was because there was so much boat noise. So I think those fish were making sounds way more often than that, but I couldn't see or hear the sounds because it was completely drowned out by the boats. So I would love to do kind of a behavior and sound study where we looked at those points that had really high boat noise and see if fish react to it. I've actually proposed that as kind of like a directed studies project for an undergraduate student. So hopefully I'll be able to do that in the future as well, because I think it'd be really interesting. But we will be doing a lot more kind of research on the boat noise impacts, hopefully in the future.
When you said that projected study student, I can just imagine someone out at Banfield like renting the boat and going out past their study site at like set times or something like that. That'd be amazing. That'd be great.
Yeah.
The questions keep coming in. So the next one is,
Great.
would the sounds be different in different temperature water? Not necessarily the rockfish, because I guess they're thinking about the temperature limits for rockfish, but other animals that transit through different temperature water.
Yeah, so temperature makes a really big difference to sounds. So, I mean, I think the sound itself would be the same, but the way we perceive it or record it will change. I've also done a lot of sonar work, and that's a really big thing. You need to get those the information on the temperature in the water column because it changes how quickly the sound moves. So I do think depending on the temperature of the water, the sound could change. I'm not sure how dramatically it would affect it though. I know in terms of sonar studies, it's quite small differences. So I would be hopeful that it would be recognizable still, but it's probably something that should be studied for sure.
Cool. I have one. This is I feel like what you get asked at every grad study thingy, but what you've learned so far, and then thinking about Rockfish Conservation Areas, I'm going to give you the bonus of imagine money's not an issue. Like,
Okay.
do you think there's a good, effective way? Like, do you have like a study that like how you would set it up to do effective monitoring?
Yeah, so I think the advantage of this again is the fact that these microphones can be left out for so long. So you could have these stationary kind of arrays set up, and you wouldn't need to use the massive array that I'm using now. That's super complicated and annoying to use, honestly. But now that we know the different species sounds and the call rates, you should just be able to put out a single hydrophone. So it could be as simple as having a hydrophone down on a sandbag, and you could have, I mean, in the rockfish conservation areas, thinking of that, you could have maybe, depending on the size of them, 3 to 10 at various points throughout the conservation area. And it would be fantastic if you could leave it out all year round, and then you just collect it once a year and you download the data, then you redeploy it. And that means rather than these massive like dive surveys or fishery surveys, It's just basically 1 or 2 days of field work where you go out and drop your hydrophones and pick them up once a year, and then you do all the analysis on it in that year. I think it also has a lot of applicability for kind of regional monitoring by First Nation groups in their territories and small conservation groups, where you could have kind of these even citizen science projects, because this fish sound detector is going to be open access, so anyone can use it. So yeah, it has massive implications for monitoring long term, I think, in a lot of different areas.
Oh yeah, that sounds amazing. And like, would the number of hydrophones affect your kind of like accuracy and estimate? Because you did say you can get like a relatively decent estimate of abundance as well as just who's there, right?
Totally. We're
Or,
still working on the abundance side. We don't know if there is that relationship between number of fish and number of calls yet. I think it's quite likely, but we need to dig more into that. I'm actually hoping to do a postdoc on that. But yeah, it has probably depends on the type of monitoring you want to do. But ideally, if you're trying to do actual stock assessment, you'd have quite a few points, because like I said, the fish sounds don't travel super far. So you're really just getting those kind of pinpoint estimates, kind of like what you get from those drop camera surveys. So you'd need decent coverage to get a nice estimate of actual abundance, true abundance. But it would be great for relative abundance estimates as well.
awesome. Okay, next one. How do fish hear sounds? Can you describe that?
Absolutely.
Like, how do the fish hear each other?
The way that they hear sounds is so cool. So some fish actually have they have what's called an otolith, and it is this fancy little ear bone. But what they have is running along the side of their body, something called a lateral line. And it's full of all these little cells that detect sound waves moving through the water. So what happens is a sound wave will hit the side of their body and it will travel up into this otolith, which is a tiny little bone that is kind of hanging in a sac of fluid. And the way that that fluid moves, it'll move the ear bone around, and that's how they detect sound. So they're able to detect sounds actually through pressure waves, which is quite different than how humans hear it. So they can detect something called particle motion, which is really unique and makes them extremely sensitive to sounds. And some species of fish are really sensitive to sounds. They're called hearing specialists. And then some species of fish, usually the ones that don't make sounds themselves, are not very good at hearing. And so some species can't hear at all, but a lot of fish species can. And rockfish, of course, can.
Awesome. Is the process of getting permission to submerge equipment in the areas very difficult? I think this is about when we were talking about RCAs, but I guess other places as well.
Yeah, one of the great things about the acoustic study is that it's really low impact. So especially ours, because we were placing it with divers and we lowered it really slowly off a boat, and it's basically just sitting down there untouched for quite a few weeks. So it was not that, I mean, it was kind of hard because I had to get research permits from Bamfield and UVic. And then I also used DFO divers. So I kind of had 3 research permits going on. But in terms of doing things like animal care, when you're doing like lethal sampling, if you're going to kill any of the fish, that's a lot more difficult to get permission. But this was quite simple because everyone knows that it's not going to hurt the fish at all.
Awesome. Still more questions. Here we go. I heard what I think were midshipmen when I was camping near the mouth of Big Qualicum River, and that got me really interested in fish sound. Oh, not a question, but that's awesome. That's cool.
That's great.
Do you know what midshipmen sound like?
Midshipmen are amazing. They're these crazy fish that live in really shallow water during the breeding season, and they make this low humming sound to attract mates. And it's so loud that you can actually hear it from shore, like this participant said. It's really incredible.
Thank you. everyone, thank you so much for your questions. That I love what an engaged audience you are, even though, you know, we're in this weird time where we have no screens and no talking to each other, but the chat is lit up and I really appreciate you all being so engaged. Next month, like we have Marine Night every last Monday of the month. We're going to have a talk by Erin Rainey, and Erin Rainey is a wildlife film and photographer. She's done a bunch of stuff that you'd probably recognize through like National Geographic. She has like a series out right now, I think, on penguins. She's told me about polar bears. She's told me about Africa. Anyway, it's going to be incredible. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of cool footage. So join us. But Darienne, I really, really, really enjoyed your talk today. So
Thank you
that's
so much.
great.
It was so nice to share it with all of you.
And with that, everyone have a good night.
Bye, guys.
Thanks very much. That was great.